Welcome to Two, everybody. Thank you for joining on a Friday afternoon on the East Coast of the United States, whether you're joining on YouTube Live or here on the Two-Way platform. Very grateful to have you here for a conversation that I'm very much looking forward to. Dr. Jordan Peterson is one of the most influential thinkers in the world right now and has been for a while. We were talking right before we started, his real life, when he's confronted in person, it's people who are honored to meet him, delighted to meet him, and interested in his ideas. But if you know Dr. Peterson and read about him, you know that he's always described as both. You're always described as both influential and controversial. I find those two words. We're going to talk a fair amount about free speech and about the presidential campaign and the genesis of this engagement. This episode was talking to Dr. Peterson about his view of Vice President Harris. And I want to just set the table a little bit, which is, as those of you who are regulars on Two-Way know, this is a forum for free discussion for all ideas. And when you hear someone say something you don't agree with, the idea is to learn from them, not to be angry, not to criticize me and others who are building this platform, but to recognize that there are disagreements out there and that those disagreements should be a source of opportunity for understanding. I got several notes when this event was announced, fewer than I feared, from people saying, how could you give a platform to such a person? One of the most influential thinkers in the world? Sure, I would love to give a platform for that person. And what I said was, if you don't like Dr. Peterson, or you think you don't, come and listen and learn. Now, this platform is, as I've said many times, is for people to engage in ideas, not invective and not criticism. And some of the things Dr. Peterson has to say about Vice President Harris are critical. And some of them are things that some people won't agree with. But I will say, if you don't like his description of Kamala Harris, you've probably heard people on this platform, I know you have if you've been here before, who have called Donald Trump all sorts of things. And yet you don't object to that. You don't say, well, Mark, you shouldn't be giving a platform to someone who's called Donald Trump a narcissist or a war criminal or a criminal or whatever it is. So I'll ask everybody, when we start to bring you in for questions, and I see there are already some hands up, when you're participating in the chat, remember, we're trying to create a revolutionary platform of two-way discussion between thought leaders and people from around the country and around the world. And in order to do that, everybody has to appreciate the spirit of what we're doing. I'm interested in Dr. Peterson's ideas. I'm sure I don't agree with all of them, but none of them would make me say he shouldn't be on here, and none of them would make me angry that he said what he said. He's a big proponent of free speech, and there's a massive irony here that people are trying to say, well, some people say he shouldn't be here. I'm glad to see all of you joining. Dr. Peterson, thank you for joining.
My pleasure.
So tell me about how you thought about, before a month ago when Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee, how much did you think about her, what kind of person, what kind of leader she was, or is that not a subject you thought about?
I thought about it a lot. I've worked with Democrats behind the scenes I worked with Democrats behind the scenes for 5 years, trying to pull the party to the middle. I'm very attuned to the nuances of American politics. And I wouldn't say that my attempts to work with Democrat the messaging apparatus to pull the party to the middle were particularly successful. But it was certainly something I put a lot of time and effort into. And I reached out to Democrats in the House and in the Senate for a very long period of time through my extensive connection network, inviting dozens of people to join me on my podcast, and almost without exception, that was met with rejection. And that certainly wasn't something I experienced on the Republican side. It's actually quite a surprise to me, I would say, that I found it more straightforward and much less I found it much more straightforward to speak with Republicans in the United States, and I wouldn't have necessarily predicted that. You know, I'm a Northern Albertan. It isn't necessarily the case that I have a lot in common, let's say, with an evangelical Protestant from the Southern U.S. But it turns out I can talk to people like that because the Republicans, in my experience, aren't cancel culture oriented, and I don't have to walk on eggshells. If I go to Washington, which I've done many, many times, I always have to walk on eggshells when I'm speaking with the Democrats, except in private. With the Republicans, I can say whatever I want. And some of them are happy with what I say, with some of it, and some of them aren't. It doesn't matter. We can still talk. So it's a massive difference. And I've watched Vice President Harris for a very long time, and also the Biden administration. So I'm well informed with regards to the nuances of American politics.
What motivated you to want to try to contribute to bringing the Democratic Party to the center?
Well, I'm not a fan of radical leftists. I know a lot about totalitarian states. I've studied the psychological origins of totalitarianism since I was 13 years old. And it was a main part of my research work. It's been a central feature of my books, all of my work, the fundamental genesis of my work in general. And part of the reason that what I've done has come to broad public attention is because of the work I've done on the psychology of authoritarian and totalitarian states. And they obviously exist on the right, insofar as the right wing is defined by, let's say, ethno-nationalism, as in the case of Nazi Germany, but arguably, perhaps beyond dispute, the worst totalitarian systems were radical leftist systems. And no one learns about that in junior high or high school. It's a secret. I mean, I taught about the Stalinist purges and Mao's atrocities in my personality course at the University of Toronto and at Harvard for second-year students. But because I considered Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the best expose on the Stalinist system, the most effective expose ever penned, won the Nobel Prize for it, I considered him an existential psychologist, which is essentially what he was. And most of my students, although they were very educated and very good students, had never heard of any of the communist atrocities, despite the fact that they were top-rate students and had been in the education system for 15 years. It's absolutely 100% inexcusable. It's inexcusable that the left, in fact, in my field, in the field of psychology, especially social psychology, the bloody psychologists didn't even admit there was such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism until 2016. It was only right-wing, which is so preposterous. It's kind of a miracle of willful blindness and stupidity. And so there are a lot of radical leftists in the Democrat ranks, and the moderates will not draw a line between them and the radicals. So I had many conversations, for example, with moderate and well-meaning Democrats. Dean Phillips, for example, springs to mind, who was absolutely pilloried by the Democrats when he dared to put his name forward as a presidential candidate, even though that was obviously necessary. He was one of the first Democrats who realized that there was something not so right about Biden in the cognitive department, let's say. And even people like Dean would excuse Kamala, for example, for speaking about equity. Their conclusion always was, oh, she didn't really mean equality of outcome, even though that's exactly what she said repeatedly and used graphics to indicate that. They just mean equality of opportunity. It's like, no, they don't. They mean equity. They mean equality of outcome. And there's no clearer marker of an ideology that's associated with the kind of radical leftism that destroys countries than the doctrine of equality of outcome. So, and people just don't understand this. Equity, oh, it's harmless. It's not bloody well harmless.
Besides Dean Phillips, are there other Democrats you've talked to or studied who you'd say are constructive parts of how you'd like to see the Democratic Party orient itself?
Oh, I think it's indisputable that the majority of people in on the Democrat side are basic moderates. But the thing about the more liberal thinkers, let's say the more progressive thinkers, that they have a very difficult time drawing distinctions and putting up borders. And so they won't admit to the presence of the radicals within their ranks, and they excuse them consistently. And I would say that's universal. I mean, even when I talked to RFK, because I did an interview with RFK, and he's a pretty forthright character. And I asked all the Democrats I ever talked to, I always asked the same question: when does the left go too far? And RFK's response to that is, I don't want to run that kind of divisive campaign. And the response universally from all the other Democrats I asked that question to was some variant of hand waving. They'd ask me, I'd say, well, for me, one of the dividing lines is equity. If you start talking about equity, although you might not even know it, you're possessed by a radical ideology that's anti-private property, anti-free market, which basically means anti-free exchange. It's not capitalism. which is that's a demented word, capitalism. It's basically a Marxist. It's basically a Marxist concept. Capitalism is free exchange, and that means you get to own things and invest your money and benefit as a consequence of your own labor and your capital, for that matter. Equity makes a complete mockery of that. So, and people don't understand that. They're not interested. Not interested. Naive, I would say. They're naive. Yeah. I asked Dean Phillips, for example, why he was a Democrat, and he gave me a story about his grandmother and Hubert Humphrey back in 1965. It's like, fair enough, Dean, and I can understand that, but it's not 1965. It's not even 2015. Seriously, like this, the world is not what it was 40 years ago, and the Democrat Party is not what it was either. So very dangerous.
I'm going to ask you about Donald Trump, but first I want to ask you about the vice president, and I'll ask my colleagues to put up a tweet of yours, which I think summarizes a position. Now, again, the language of this is negative. I think that's a fair use of the word, to be clear. But this is your point of view about her. And it's going to be a little hard to read. Go ahead and take that full and take Dr. Peterson and me down so everybody can see it. There you go. So provoke, turn the tables on achieving a response, lie, joy, narcissist manipulation par excellence. She's a master of chaos and deception. Absolutely. So let's focus on narcissistic manipulation. What do you mean when you say that she's involved in narcissistic manipulation?
It isn't just her, it's her advisor class as well. Well, there's a psychologist, J.D. Haltigan, who's been making much of this on Twitter. He's one of the few psychologists that's willing to use his clinical acumen to analyze the current pathology of the political situation. So there is a cluster of personality disorders known as cluster B, and that includes histrionic, narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial. The antisocial personality types are generally male. The other three categories are generally female. And the typical behavior of someone who manifests that complex of traits is to provoke continually, to provoke an argument on one grounds, let's say, for a self-serving reason, and to push that and push that and push that continually until they evoke a response of some sort from their target, and to be unbelievably persistent and manipulative about that. And then when the person responds, to act aggrieved and victimized, to pretend that the discussion had absolutely nothing to do with that, to accuse the person who's now defending themselves or reacting of like weirdness, let's say, which is obviously what the Kamala, the Harris-Walz campaign is doing, and then to pretend that the whole discussion was about something else all along, and that the people that were targeted are just being strange to even imagine that that might have been the case. Look, it isn't the conservatives or the classic liberals who have made race and diversity and equity and inclusivity the central topic of discussion for the last 10 years. It is 100% the liberal progressive types and all of their media acolytes, all educated in the institutions of higher education, who have made these diversity issues center stage. And for the Harris campaign to fail to put forward any policies whatsoever, and then to accuse the conservatives and classic liberals of concentrating on the wrong issues, because it's always been the economy and healthcare and education all along, is signs of exactly the kind of pathology that I'm describing. It is the most deceptive political campaign I've ever seen in my life. And like she is running 100% on image. It's so interesting to see, because obviously part of the reason that Harris had political success to begin with, career success, is because she fit the DEI stereotype so perfectly. She's a minority female, so she hits the intersectional checklist categories, and she is running, as far as I can tell, 100% on that. It's a 100% image campaign, and so that's a remarkable thing to see, and it's quite terrifying also that it's so successful. You know, what's Harris? Well, she isn't an angry old white man. It's like, that's typical histrionic narcissistic argumentation and behavior, that's for sure. And I see every sign of that in the campaign, and people have no idea how dangerous that is. No idea at all. So it's a remarkable thing to see.
Yeah, I want to talk to you. I want to follow up on what you just said. I'll remind you, as I do everybody here in a friendly way, how to pronounce her name accurately. It's Kamala, like the punctuation mark. Kamala.
Yeah, that's my
Just out of
Canadian
respect.
accent mangling it.
Yeah.
I also say
All right.
Obama, pretty
Yeah.
sad.
I
And
hear it.
taco.
Okay.
Yeah. So don't be making fun of
So
my culture there, Mark.
yeah, I know what your accent's about because I used to work with
Yeah.
Peter Jennings, and so
Yeah.
I've heard it for many years. All right, so that's your critique, and you say she's doing well, and I know because you said it and because it's true. In part, she's doing well because the press is all for her. Is she saying anything that you think is from your point of view is positive? Is any basis of her appeal and popularity based on things that you think are good in a leader, either in her issue positions or her style of leadership, or is it all negative as far as you're concerned?
Well, there's so much about what's transpired in the US in the last month that's miraculous that I think in some ways it's beside the point. Well, first of all, let's just walk through this for a moment or two. Well, she's never been placed in front of the populace in any credible manner in a way that would give her credence as an actual leader. She was appointed as VP. She didn't run through the primary process. There's no indication whatsoever that she would have been chosen, and plenty of evidence that she wouldn't have been. So she replaced Biden, apparently because of his cognitive incompetence, and the Democrats had lost faith in him, despite the fact that apparently we're all supposed to believe and accept without question that he's still competent to be president. She's running a campaign that has no policies whatsoever. And she's running, as I pointed out already, purely on image. And so I'm not going to overlook all of that and say, well, now and then she might say something that bears repeating or deeper analysis. It's like it's so preposterous that it's beyond comprehension. You also may have noticed that in the last couple of days, she actually did utter a few words on policy and suggested that she would bring in price controls for corporate grocery price gouging. Well, grocery consortiums make a very small profit margin. Like, it's remarkably small. It's amazing they can stay in business at all. And the idea that the first major policy initiative that she would put forward has to do with price controls is, well, first of all, indicative of her far left leanings. And second, a solution to a problem that's so preposterous that, once again, it's a miracle. If she institutes price controls, all that will do is produce black market and shortages, which is always what it does everywhere. And that's entirely well documented. So, no, I'm not about to give her any credence. The other thing I would say about Harris is that when she does speak, she's vapid and incoherent, which is quite the combination. I've never seen a politician in my life capable of stringing together inanities with the remarkable capacity she has. And it's very easily parodied. And so, you can also tell, it's so interesting watching this, because, as I said, she's running a campaign that's fundamentally predicated on image. And she's quite good at that. And that's also a good marker for this kind of manipulativeness that I was talking about. But they also are keeping her, her handlers, let's say, with her say-so, they're keeping her away from anything that would constitute spontaneous utterance or press conferences. Time magazine did a famous cover of her, which is kind of a socialist, realist, propagandistic, heroic image. And the Time put it on their cover, which I think in some ways was inexcusable to begin with, given that she didn't even offer them an interview. It's like, what the hell's going on? Why did she deserve that homage?
Yeah, you're saying a lot of stuff I want to follow up on, but I want to get to people's questions in a little bit. So again, if you want to get in the conversation, please raise your hand. You said in your tweet, and you said now, you used the word lie, that you accused her of lying. You typed it about 8 times. So I know you feel strongly about it. What's an example you think, like a good example of something she's lying about?
Well, she's lying about the idea that the Republicans are strange for turning their attention to the culture war and presuming that it was the Republicans that are strange because this has become an issue. The Democrats have been pushing the culture war since since 1965, and it's accelerated radically since 2015. So this whole campaign that the Republicans, J.D. Vance, for example, who is a working class guy who hauled himself up by his bootstraps from an absolutely abysmal background, that somehow J.D. Vance is a strange person for focusing on the culture war elements that the Democrats have made first and foremost in every political discussion for like 20 years. That all of that's a lie. The idea that Kamala and Walz are all about joy. Really, they're all about joy. I mean, every bit of what she's doing is a lie. And the turning the tables in particular, the turning the tables, it's such a brilliantly manipulative move. I'm quite stunned by it, and it's been quite effective. So it's remarkable to see.
All right, I want to ask you a little bit about President Trump, and again, we're going to get to folks' questions in a minute. As you know, people in America and around the world call Donald Trump a narcissist all the time. That's one of the main things people say about him. You've said that's true of the vice president. Do you think it's true of Donald Trump? Is he a narcissist?
Well, the thing about Trump is he has a sense of humor. And that's actually a relatively rare thing in someone who's narcissistic. Now, Trump is very extroverted, and he's quite disagreeable. And those are the two personality traits that tilt people towards narcissism. But my understanding of Trump is that he's also very conscientious. He's very hardworking and diligent and disciplined. And that's partly what accounts for the success he's had in multiple domains. And so that modifies his proclivity towards narcissism. I mean, Trump has sought the spotlight for much of his life. And so people who seek the spotlight in that manner, you know, who's prone to what occupations are prone to invasion by narcissists? Entertainment, media, politics, because people are in the public eye. Is Trump a narcissist? Well, he's extroverted, so he's very gregarious and social and dominant in his speech, and he's quite tough-minded and disagreeable. And so he's got that in common with people who have narcissistic pathology. But the thing about Trump is he's also extremely conscientious, and that's a huge mitigating factor. Now, you know, I've been a reluctant convert to both the Republican and the Trump camps, let's say, and I would have rather seen someone like DeSantis as the Republican candidate, because I think it's high time for someone to be president who's basically a competent administrator. But DeSantis didn't run a very, very effective campaign, and Trump did. And then let's take Trump apart in some other ways too. So, you know, we don't have to do a lot of guessing about a Trump administration because we already had one. And the most marked thing for me about the Trump presidency was that he involved the United States in no wars. And that's a big deal. And so he certainly didn't let his ego manifest itself in the narcissistic way as a warmonger or a pseudo-militaristic commander-in-chief. He actually made peace. And it's also the case that Trump's ability to act as an effective bully has, what would you say, unintended positive benefits on the international front, because I do believe that Trump is the sort of person that makes people like Putin and the president of China and the dictator of North Korea think twice about mucking about. But most importantly, you know, we should point to the fact that there were no wars, and his administration implemented the Abraham Accords. And the Trump administration 100% should have got the Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords, which was a masterstroke of creative diplomacy.
Dr. Peterson, how would you handicap the race now? Do you think Donald Trump's the favorite? Do you think he's the underdog? How would you handicap it currently?
Well, we could default to the historical actuarial statistics. I mean, you guys in the US, you've been split 50-50 on the Republican Democrat side for what, about 20 years. There's no indication whatsoever that that's changed. And this is also partly why there have been accusations about election, inappropriate behavior surrounding elections that have been quite constant. When it's 50-50, it doesn't take much corruption to distort the outcome of an election. And so I would say the default prediction is 50-50. This is going to go right down to the wire.
If she wins, will it say anything about America? And if so, what?
Well, you can run an effective campaign on image. You know, I mean, most people, I think the average person from the polling that I'm familiar with, the average person thinks about politics about 3 minutes a week. And if you only think about politics in that low resolution manner, especially if you're getting your information from the social media channels that are more shallow, like TikTok is a really good example of that, then an image-based campaign can be very effective. And so if Harris wins, well, that's a testament to the power of shallow image-based political campaigning. It's also, there's another thing to keep in mind too, and I've thought about this a lot lately. You know, back when the Berlin Wall fell and the communist edifice collapsed, there was a lot of triumphalism on the part of the West as victors, that the communist menace had been permanently eradicated and that free market democratic systems had the permanent upper hand. And that was a very naive presupposition, because I think that the socialist ethos of wealth distribution is the natural mode of human thinking. You have to be educated out of that. You know, you imagine that within our families, for example, we hope for something like equality of outcome. We hope all our children do equally well. We gerrymander the playing field to give our kids who are struggling a leg up. And we tend to share everything among us within a family in a sort of communistic manner. But that doesn't scale to large organizations, to maybe beyond the tribal level. And so you have to educate people out of that blindly empathic and compassionate socialist ethos. And we haven't done a good job of that in the West. We've done a very bad job.
Okay, I want to ask you two more questions, and I'm going to open it up to the group again. Lots of hand raised. Please join in if you want. First question is, what are 3 things Donald Trump needs to do to win, in your view?
What are 3 things that Donald Trump needs to do to win? I can't answer that question. You know, I would love to be able to be intelligent enough to specify the appropriate pathway forward for President Trump, but I don't know. My basic default position with regards to campaign strategy is, like, I'm pretty happy with people who just tell the truth. I'm not much of a strategist. I don't craft my language. I just say what I think. And
Yeah.
I think Trump is pretty good at that. You know, it's one of the things I think that he should be given credit for, because one of the things that's quite remarkable about Trump is that he is really good at speaking to his audience spontaneously, right? Unscripted, without teleprompter. And Trump has that as a superpower. The other thing he could do, well, here's one thing that would be practical. You see, Donald Trump is an old man, and one of the consequences of that is that it's almost inevitable that he isn't up to date with regard to understanding of the current communication milieu. My perspective, I'm on the cutting edge of the social media world, and I have been basically since its inception. It's a very difficult place to position yourself, because you have to be technologically savvy and you have to pay attention to a lot. Because if you're not on the cutting edge, people forget about you instantly. My sense, strong sense, both personally and what would you say, this is also a consequence of looking at the data, is that the legacy media is fundamentally dead. CNN is dead. MSNBC is dead. The Washington Post is dead. Even the New York Times is likely dead. And Trump still lives in a world where the legacy media is the prime means of communication. That's a big mistake. He should be on podcasts nonstop. He should ignore the legacy media completely. They are not his friend. He should devote no. I'll give you an example. Let me give you an example. So in Canada, we have a leader of our Conservative Party who will likely be the next prime minister. His name is Pierre Poilievre. And Pierre ran his campaign to obtain the leadership of the Conservative Party without talking to the legacy media at all. He ran his own YouTube channel. He made his own ads. He made his own what do you call those movies that are fact-based? Documentaries. He made his own documentaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he won the leadership doing that. And then he's communicated with Canadians directly. Trump could completely bypass CNN, MSNBC. They hate him anyways. They never treat him fairly. It was a big mistake to have the presidential debate on CNN, even though CNN actually did a pretty good job. It should have been done on X or on Rogan. He should bypass the legacy media 100%. And also because young people are on new social media platforms, and so he could speak to young people directly that way.
Yeah. I need to follow up on one thing you said and then ask you my last question. You can say a lot of positive things about Donald Trump or factual things. To say that he doesn't lie regularly would just be factually not true. Do you agree with that? That he regularly says things that aren't true?
Well, he's a funny character in that manner because Trump is one of those people. He's a natural storyteller, and a natural storyteller will compromise the details to get the big picture right. He's very good at giving the big picture right. So let me give you an example of that.
Yeah.
And I think it addresses your point specifically. Well, after Trump was defeated, he made a large fuss about the fact that the election was stolen. And then there were many trials about the the accused improprieties at the local electoral level. And Trump lost, I believe, all of those appeals. But
he did.
But his point that the election was stolen was true. So, for example, and I looked into this in great detail. So I interviewed Miranda Devine, who was New York Post reporter from Australia, who broke the Hunter Biden laptop story. And what's on the Hunter Biden laptop is so dark that no one with any sense would look at it because it's really quite terrifying. Hunter Biden is a very dark person, very dark. And there's absolutely no doubt that the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed. It was suppressed by Twitter, it was suppressed by the mainstream media, and it was suppressed by the government. And a very large number of people from the intelligence community called it Russian disinformation. And that all broke 2 weeks before the last election. And in my estimation, the lies that surrounded the Hunter Biden laptop story were of sufficient magnitude to distort the results of the election. So he got the details wrong, but he got the big story right.
I agree with you and Miranda about the facts around the Hunter Biden laptop and its suppression. But Donald Trump has told lies about other things he asserts about the election being stolen, regarding votes being stolen, regarding election officials, improperly tampering with vote counting. Those are not lies about storytelling. Those are lies meant to distort the public debate. Would you concede that it's not about storytelling in that case? He's saying things that are materially false and influence the public opinion in a way that's not good for a democracy that should be based on truth. Would you agree with that?
I already said that if it was my choice, I would have picked someone like DeSantis to stand for the Republican leadership. And we don't have that. And we have Trump with his pros and his cons, and his capacity to dissimulate is well known. And is that a positive thing? Obviously not. So.
Okay. I'm going to bring folks in. And again, I'll remind everybody, I'm starting with someone who I know will be civil, because Ray is a great believer in this platform and its ethos. So Ray is from Ohio, and Ray, go ahead and ask Dr. Peterson whatever you'd like.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Peterson. I have two quick questions. One, are your feelings towards Vice President Harris and the Democrats based on observation and scholarship, or are they based on the rejection you say that you've experienced at the hands of those Democrats, or a combination of both?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's hard to distinguish between those two things, isn't it? Because one of the things that has happened to me over the last 10 years, let's say, is that I've found it much more difficult to speak with people on the left than on the right. And that isn't something I would have expected, say, 5 years before that. But that is what happened. Now, it's very difficult on a personal level not to like people who like you back more than you like people who don't like you back. And what would you say, distorted my view? Likely. Now I would say in my own defense, as I said earlier, that I spent a lot of time speaking to Democrats, a lot of time, and trying to bridge the gap between the political parties and to pull the Democrats to the center. So I think I've put in my time doing my best to communicate with the remaining liberal core of the Democrats. Am I biased to some degree in consequence of how I've been treated by the radicals? Likely. And I try to defend myself against that, to stay as objective as I can possibly manage. But, it's a difficult thing not to let your own personal experience affect the manner in which you construe a situation.
Ray,
I appreciate that very much. That actually led directly into my second question, so I'm done. Thank you very much.
Okay. Ray, thank you. Good question. And Dr. Peterson, good answer. Let's bring in Mary. Sorry, there we go. Mary, come on in. Unmute, ask your question, please.
Okay, just a second here.
You're good, Mary. Go ahead.
Okay, good.
You are.
It's great to talk to you, Jordan. I'm a big fan. I've listened to a lot of your discussions. I've worked for a lot of politicians on and off, and I think they all have a certain level of narcissism that's kind of just to be expected for someone who thinks that they can, be at those levels. But I'm curious because I think our politics has really evolved into a personality contest versus somebody who's really looking at how someone's policy could affect their life. And I just was curious whether you had an impression or an idea of when that kind of evolved in US politics at all, or would you have a sense of when it changed?
I think the less informed you are politically, the more you make decisions based on what's obvious about a given person. And the first thing that would be most obvious is whether you have a feeling of liking them or not. And then what you do after that is you modify that decision as a consequence of looking at what they do in detail. When you first meet someone, you have a first impression. And if you have a negative first impression, it's often difficult to overcome it, but sometimes you can. And what you do is you gather more detailed information and modify your initial impression. Now, because people aren't attending to the details of politics very particularly, often because they're not interested or because they're preoccupied with their own life, the default contest in any political race is going to be something like a personality contest. Now, that's not optimal, but what would you say, a civilized and sophisticated society puts institutions in place that help people make more informed decisions, but it's an uphill struggle always. You're always struggling against your first impressions and the likability of someone.
Mary, thank you. Great question. Okay, let's bring in Charlie from Georgia. Go ahead, unmute. Ask away.
Hey, Dr. Peterson, thanks for your scholarship and your efforts to bring people to the middle. Maybe we need to spend more time together on this one.
Charlie, you're cutting out a little bit. I'm gonna have to try to bring you back with a stronger Wi-Fi signal. All right.
The presidency has.
Good. Go ahead, Charlie. Keep going. See if we can hear you.
All right.
No. All right. Apologize.
I just think that the presidency has always been about image, from George Washington to President Kennedy on debates with Nixon, and on today it's going to be even more about it. The presidency is also about popularity, and
all right.
I think that this week it's not going to be legal.
Charlie, you're gonna have to just have to ask your question, Charlie. Just ask your question.
Dr. Peterson, who do you think is more, your studies in totalitarianism, who do you think is more likely to bring us into that state, candidate Harris or candidate Trump?
Yeah, which one and why, Dr. Peterson?
Well, I mentioned what my experience has been speaking with the left and the right on the US political scene. And I believe that the proclivity on the Democrat side to tilt towards authoritarian leftism right now is extremely strong. I've seen it in the universities where it's become the dominant force by a large margin. I believe the same thing is very, very likely on the Democrat side. Now, does that mean that the US has degenerated into an authoritarian state? No, I don't think so. I mean, your system is very robust, and I'm speaking of it from the perspective of an outside observer. You have 50 states, each of which is its own independent experiment. And one of the things that's remarkable to observe in the US is that no matter how crazy some of you get, there are some people in the US somewhere who have enough freedom to do the right thing and to be sane. And so you see that now, is that as states like California descend into whatever mess they're descending into, people just move and they go to places where they have a chance to pursue the American dream in its forthright manner. And so there's always something sane going on in the US. And you guys are so good at reinventing yourself continually. It's a remarkable thing to watch from the outside. And so your systems are very robust. And so the probability that your country will degenerate into an authoritarian state as a consequence of a shift in presidential leadership, I think is pretty low. There might be more of a threat on the technology side at the moment, all things considered, but I don't by any means think that the situation is hopeless.
Dr. Peterson, next questioner, Alex Castellanos, is known in some quarters as the Jordan Peterson of Cuba. He's a Republican, and I'm curious to see what he's going to want to ask you. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you. It's a treat to listen to you, Dr. Peterson. Yes, I am from Cuba, and I do love freedom. And I wanted to ask you, have you looked at our two political parties, left and right, through the prism of your work on hierarchies? Sometimes you can make the argument that there's one party that believes in the hierarchy of accomplishment and achievement, and if you don't make it in that hierarchy, what do? Maybe you create another hierarchy of entitlement and self-declared moral superiority. Have you thought about that way?
That's a perfectly reasonable summary, I think. That's exactly what I was alluding to with regards to the psychopathology on the radical leftist side. The war against merit as a concept, let's say, which is a postmodern, what it derives from a postmodern critique of notions of merit. It's a very foolish critique. It plays right into the hands of people who want to live a parasitical lifestyle and who believe that they're entitled to the hard-got gains of other people. I mean, this is partly why I think anti-Semitism is such a terrible and dangerous phenomenon. So, because historically and now, the Jews have always been a hyper-successful minority. That's documented, well documented, going back thousands of years. And they're successful. When anti-Semitism rises, what you're seeing underneath that is something like a rebellion against the idea of success. Well, if a society first goes after the Jews because they're disproportionately successful, the next people on the chopping block are anyone else who's successful. If you define private property as theft, if you define success as oppression, if you believe that any hierarchical status is a consequence of victimization, then you're demonizing success itself. And obviously, any society that demonizes success is going to collapse. The idea that there's no merit, this has already been dealt with to some degree technically by industrial organizational psychologists. So let's say I want to hire someone and I want to do it legally. I have to do an analysis of the requirements of the job, like a technical analysis. Here's the behaviors that you have to manifest to do this job. Then I have to find a predictor that's associated with those outcomes. And that's the definition of merit. Well, if you believe that a job is necessary and must be done, there's an implicit definition of merit lurking in that. And then you select for that merit. If you don't believe that there's any such thing as merit, you actually don't believe that there's any such thing as a job. And it's definitely the case that the radical leftist strain in the Democrat Party is anti-merit. And it's unbelievably destructive. And it does lead to the rise of those who claim that all accomplishment is theft. That's what happened in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. All the farmers that were successful were killed. All of the businessmen that were successful were killed. Anybody that had any peasants who raised themselves out of the muck after the freeing of the serfs, they were all put to the knife as the resentful and envious, anti-meritorious equity seekers decimated the economy. And that's happened in every socialist paradise. And all it results in is the kind of catastrophic poverty, for example, that's encouraged 1/4 of Venezuela to leave the country in the last 20 years. Stunning.
Alex, thank you. Clara, tell us where you're calling from, who you're supporting in the presidential race, and your question for Dr. Peterson.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I'm 81 and your platforms add a lot to my life. So thanks a lot.
Thank you for being part of it.
Sure.
Claire, where are you? Where are you and who are you supporting?
Sorry. I'm in Maryland, Silver Spring, I think both parties are authoritarian. I'm writing in someone's name. I'm a registered Democrat and I'm center right.
All right, don't write in Dr. Peterson because he's Canadian, so he can't win. So don't waste your vote there. But go ahead with your question.
Understood. Yes, Dr. Peterson, very fortunate to be able to talk to you. I'm wondering, independent of who wins in November, and possibly drawing from the literature on mass movements, how can the movement of the left in the United States best be slowed down economically, politically, culturally?
No, that's a great question and also a very difficult one. Well, I've tried to. The utopian dreams of the radical leftists are essentially a replacement for something like traditional belief in the sacred, belief at a very deep level. And when traditional belief systems decompose, utopian dreams rise to replace them, or nihilism, let's say, or hedonism. Those would be the alternatives. What's the alternative to that? Well, I just wrote a book called We Who Wrestle with God, and this theme runs through much of my work that's making a case for the ethic that's put forth in the classic biblical texts of the West. Like the classic biblical texts insist, for example, that the community is predicated on sacrifice, right? That in order to be part of a community, you have to give up your proclivity to put your own narrow, immediate interests first. And to join a community, to join a marriage, to join a family, to join a broader community, it's a sacrificial process. And the biblical texts, for example, detail out the nature of that sacrificial process and what's involved. And that was at the base of our very functional culture for thousands of years for a very good reason. And so I've tried to make that case in my work, particularly in the book that'll be launched in November. I started a new online university, Peterson Academy. We brought together remarkable professors from all over the world to offer to people as broadly as possible the opportunity to be educated in a manner that's much more akin to the classic liberal or centrist conservative tradition of the West. And so I believe the problem is so deep that it's essentially religious in nature, and that the next tier above that, so to speak, isn't political, it's educational. And so I'm doing what I can to shift things at the level of the religious and at the level of the education system, with my political preoccupations being secondary to that. So we have a very deep conflict in the West. It's a very deep conflict. It's way lower than political, way more fundamental than political. And so that's partly why we're engrossed in such a contentious culture war, because this isn't political fundamentally. It's a battle between two very different views of reality itself. So, and that's the level at which it's eventually going to have to be sorted out.
Clara, I'm so glad you're part of our community, and I hope you'll come back often. Really appreciate it and appreciate the question. All right, Dr. Peterson, our next questioner is not known as the Jordan Peterson of Georgia, but he is someone I'm very much looking forward to listening to have a respectful colloquy with you. So with that, Mr. Simmons, the floor is yours. You're a Georgia supporter of Kamala Harris, I'll tell everybody.
I'm a supporter of Kamala Harris. I want to go back to the beginning of your comments, Dr. Peterson, where you started off talking about, you defined equity. And I want to understand where your definition of equity in the DEI framework comes from, because McKinsey, the globally recognized consulting firm, defines equity as fairness of processes, et cetera, to ensure that one's identity is not predictive of a negative outcome. So it's not about guaranteed outcomes, as you stated. Now, maybe Canada works differently. So I want to understand why you are equating equity with guaranteed outcomes, which would be closer to socialism. And I do want to point out that the reason that a lot of minorities and women think we need to talk about equity is that deep into the 1970s and 80s, many leading organizations would not hire people because they were female or because they were Black, and were forced to. So it seems like we need an equity discussion, and it's not by any chief diversity officer I know, and I used to be one for PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the largest companies in the world. We don't say equity is outcome. So where are you getting that definition from?
Well, Harris herself has said it, and she's also used graphics that indicate, with the placement of boxes underneath, for example, children looking over a fence, that it is equality of outcome. There's plenty of clips of Kamala describing equity as equality of outcome. And you have to ask yourself, for example, with regard to that, is, well, why the word equity? Why not the phrase equality of opportunity, which is something that everybody can agree on? And it's not like I'm making this up. The diversity, inclusivity, and equity triumvirate of beliefs is associated with all sorts of political propositions that are radically leftist. We did a study in 2016 to delve into this. So imagine that you gave 1,000 people 200 political statements and asked them to rate the degree to which they agreed with them. Okay, if you do that, you can then do a statistical analysis to find out which beliefs clump together. And so you can see if there's a statistical association that makes up a system of belief. And the system of belief that diversity, inclusivity, and equity fit within was best characterized as a form of left-wing authoritarianism. And we also looked at what predicted that. And what predicted belief in that was low intelligence, being female, and having a feminine temperament, as well as ever having taken a course that was specifically oriented towards a DEI orientation. And I mean, I'm not inventing this. There's an entire line of postmodern theory that underlies the DEI ethos, as well as a brand of neo-Marxist thought from the French intellectuals that was fabricated in the 1970s. The idea that with the major consulting companies, that when they put forward a vision of DEI with the equity being nothing more than equality of opportunity, that certainly wasn't how it worked at the universities. So I don't buy that. And when Harris speaks directly about equality of outcome, if she doesn't mean that, she should choose her words a lot more carefully. So,
hey, can I make
Chris, go ahead. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please do.
We've been doing DEI in America since at least the early 1980s. And if it meant equality of outcome, we're doing a lousy job of it, because we still only have about, I don't know, some very small percentage of female CEOs in this country.
Yeah, well, let's
about 3% corporate management people are Black in a country that's 13% Black. So if it means equality of outcome, we're doing a horrible job of getting there.
Okay, well, first of all, looking at CEO positions is a preposterous way of determining whether or not a society is equitable in opportunity or outcome. It's a very, very small percentage of men, let's say, that ever make the C-suite. And it is a small percentage of women. But women, for example, make up the vast majority of degree holders now in the United States. They're doing much better in the K through 12 system. They're radically overrepresented in the student population in universities. There are far more female physicians than there are male physicians. The enrollment rates are about 2 to 1 female to male in our educational systems. And so to parse out the CEO positions, that's just not a reasonable thing to do. Hardly anybody has a CEO position, and you have to be an incredibly dedicated and hardworking, very bright and ambitious person to even embark on something like that, assuming that you even think that you should. So, what do I use as a counterpart to that? 99% of bricklayers are men. Have we worked on the equity end for the high danger occupations that men occupy, high danger, low status occupations? Not in the least. The resentful feminists always point to the high status positions and say, well, there aren't as many women in those positions. It's like, yeah, there aren't as many women in prison. There aren't as many women who get killed. There aren't as many women who commit suicide. There aren't as many women in outside, dangerous, low-paying, high-stress jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And so the C-suite comparison is exactly the sort of comparison you'd expect people who are obsessed by power to make. They're not looking at the overall picture. You can make a very strong case. Well, Asian women,
Sorry.
for example, out-earn white men. And by quite a
I'd like to
substantial margin.
I'd like to consider the colloquy you two just had the beginning of a three-way conversation that we'll pick up over dinner, like in Omaha at some point. So, Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Lisa.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Lisa, go ahead. Tell us
Hi.
where you're from, who you're supporting in the presidential race, and ask away.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm in North Carolina. I would say I'm a disaffected Democrat, and I don't like either candidate, and I don't want to vote for either one of them. But I'm still thinking about it. And I try to imagine like the worst case scenario, like there's a world war, and who's going to be the president at that time. And I mean, Trump seems to me have certain positives in that he will stand up to foreign leaders, and he's sort of frightening. On the other hand, he is erratic, he's vindictive, and he acts childish, I think. He lashes out at anybody who hurts him. He cuts them off. In his last administration, there were sensible people, generals and stuff that he worked with, and they just completely abandoned him, and they have terrible relationships now. So I'm asking you your honest opinion. Like I almost would vote for him, but there's some serious personality flaws there.
Lisa, who did you vote for, Clinton versus Trump?
I have always voted for Democrats, and I've always voted in every election.
So why wouldn't you vote for Harris? Why isn't it automatic?
The far left, I'm so disappointed by the far left that I no longer want to be in a party with them. That's all I can say. And I mean, Harris is just not if she was a stellar candidate, it might change my mind, but I don't think she is. I'm open-minded. I'm still listening. Anyway,
all right, Dr. Peterson, you can add to your resume, voter consultant, North Carolina voter consultant. Help her make up her mind.
Well, I said already that look, the best predictor of how someone is going to do a job is how they've already done it, if you have that data. And the thing is, we do have that data with regard to Trump. And like, I have my reservations about Trump, that's for sure. I've never presented myself as a partisan Trump supporter. And so I'm speaking from the position of someone who's adopted that position historically. There were no wars under Trump. We're in at least 2 terrible wars right now that could get out of hand in a way that we can't possibly imagine. And Trump, despite the fact that everybody was concerned, let's say, that his apparent proclivity for narcissism would make him an erratic mover on the world stage, that isn't how it worked out at all. It's so important that we're not in a war that, for me, that trumps virtually everything else, so to speak. And then I am very impressed with the Abraham Accords. And we should all note this miracle that the Abraham Accords have essentially held even after October 7th. The Arab countries that signed those peace agreements with Israel, despite the fact that no one in the State Department thought that was even possible, they haven't reneged on their promise. And that was all attributable to Trump. Now, the economy did decently well under him. He racked up the deficit and the debt like every leader has since the Second World War, fundamentally. And so none of that's so good. But we already saw what he's likely to do. And I think that'll just continue. So.
Okay. Lisa, I'd love for you to come back regularly and tell us how you end up deciding to vote. And if you vote for Trump, you can dedicate it to Dr. Peterson, maybe. Thank you. Dr. Peterson, I'm so grateful to you for making time to join us. I hope you'll come back. For me, this was a great conversation. I'll tell you what makes me a little bit sad is I got a lot of messages, including from people I know during the session, saying you've made a horrible mistake having this man on your platform. I find that to be just crushingly sad because, again, this platform is for open discussion with all voices. And you're not just anybody. You're an extremely influential voice around the world. And I would hope people, even if they vociferously disagree with you, would want to hear what you'd have to say. And in some cases, folks had an opportunity to engage with you and ask questions. So, like I said, I'm grateful to you. I want to ask you one more question in the minute we have left, which is, why do you feel so passionately about America and about American politics? Why is this something that engages you and energizes you to speak at?
Oh, you people have a great country. The freedom of the world depends on your country. And the absence of freedom, I spent 40 years studying the worst atrocities that people can engage in. It's been a very eye-opening endeavor, let's say. And your country stands between us and that, and has certainly since the Second World War. These regimes that are totalitarian are so brutal that they're so brutal that people won't study them because they don't want to be shocked out of their naivety. You have a great country. And it's predicated on a very deep tradition. It's not all attributable to the great spirit of the U.S. because you guys derived your traditions from the English tradition, and that's embedded in a deeper Judeo-Christian tradition. And so there's a long history behind this. And the UK is a remarkable country, and there are Western European countries that are like that as well. But without you people doing the right thing, man, the world would be a very, very, very dark place. And so it's so important that you hang on to these remarkable freedoms. And also, see, the problem with being a Westerner is that you make the idiotic presumption that a culture of trust is the default polity. You people in the US, you can trade with each other, you can become wealthy, you can engage in your productive activity because by and large, the typical American will stand by his or her word. And that is the basis of wealth. It's not natural resources. Japan has no natural resources. It's a filthy rich country because it's a high trust, high honesty country. And you have that. It's very, very hard to build that. And it's under threat now. And so it's a terrible thing to watch from the outside anything that destabilizes the United States, because you people are a bastion of everything, really everything that makes life worth living. And you manage to do that repeatedly. And so.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. What do you think of a platform that allows someone like Jordan Peterson to speak to Americans who agree with you and who disagree with you? What's the value of that to you?
Well, what's the value of that to me?
In a civil way.
Well, look, the alternative to discussion is there's only 3 states of being in the world. There's slavery, there's tyranny, and there's free communication. That's it. And free communication is very, very difficult. It's very challenging for people to have their fundamental beliefs questioned. And there is no such thing as a serious discussion where people aren't going to feel threatened and hurt and hopeless and anxious. It's very, very difficult to discuss anything that's serious, as you find out very rapidly. For example, if you're married, people tiptoe around the truth all the time because it's disruptive. And fair enough, free speech is a brutal game. But compared to all-out mayhem and atrocity, it's a hell of a fine choice. And that is the choice. We either solve our problems in abstraction, with all the pain that comes along with that, or we fight to the death. And that is not pretty. And so free speech is the alternative to tyranny and slavery. And it comes at a cost.
Do you mind taking?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do you mind taking questions as you did tonight from people who disagree with you?
No, I don't mind if people disagree with me. I mean, look, one of the things you have to understand about disagreements is that if you are fortunate enough to talk to someone who doesn't share your viewpoint, it's possible that they know something that you don't. And it's really hard to learn a new thing. And even if you have to wade through 40 stupid objections, let's say, ill-informed objections to get to one nugget of truth, the process of discovery, painful though it may be very well worthwhile. Look, think about a discussion that you might have with your wife or your husband. If you're discussing anything difficult, there's going to be a lot of noise and trouble before you get to the central issue. It's very emotionally demanding, but man, if you can get to that nugget of truth, you can sort out your life and you can live in peace. And there's no living in peace without free speech. That's just foolish, because we all have different viewpoints. We have different temperaments. We're going to disagree about fundamentals, even about what we see. We sort that out in peace by communicating freely. Some of that's listening and some of that's talking. And free speech isn't some right the government offers you out of the beneficence of its heart. Free speech is the mechanism by which people think and society progresses. It's not an option. It's not just some right in a list of rights. It's the mechanism of thought itself. And you think, there's an old rule. You think so your thoughts can die instead of you. Right. And if sometimes when your thoughts die, that's very painful, but it's a lot less painful than going through the process of death itself. So we have to have free speech, free expression. We have to be able to listen, especially to people who disagree with us. And we should hope that our thoughts are challenged, because maybe we can find out how stupid we are before we walk off a cliff.
Dr. Peterson, so grateful to you. I hope you'll come back when your book comes out. And if you want to come back to talk about the election anytime and take questions from folks from around the world and around America, we'd love to have you. And again, grateful to you for making time today.
Hey, man, thanks for the invitation. And to all of you who asked me a question, you know, it takes a fair bit of bravery and gall to do that, to put yourself out in public and to risk asking a question. And I appreciate that. I know it's difficult. And everyone was civil and we had a decent conversation. And so hooray for that.
Thank you. I'll be back Monday morning from Chicago, 9 a.m. Eastern time with Sean and Tim for the morning meeting. And we'll have sessions, episodes all week from Chicago, from the Democratic Convention. So thanks to everybody who did ask questions, everybody who joined. Thanks to Dr. Peterson. Have a good night and a good weekend.